His anger towards the chases grew as he slowly realized his inability to deal with such men. They were promoters, people with big interests and vast influence in the Southwest. The more they did for Forlorn River, the less reason there was for his resentment. He had to accept that his feelings were personal and that he and Gorman and the Rangers would never have been able to develop the valley's resources as these men were doing it. Throughout the day, he heard the loud booming blasts and the sound of avalanches in the gorge. Chase's men were using dynamite to blast the cliffs in the narrow box canyon, building the dam just as Gorman had planned. When the blasting was over, Belding felt some relief. He would no longer be constantly reminded of his and Gorman's loss. Eventually, he resigned himself to his fate, but he couldn't come to terms with Gorman's misfortune. Belding had a lot on his mind, and the lack of news about the Rangers was not helping. There were rumors of raiders in the Sonoita area, but they could not be confirmed until the Mexican Rangers returned. When they finally did, Gonzalez, a reliable half-breed, reported meeting prospectors who had just come in from the Camino del Diablo. They had a terrible trip, enduring heat and drought, but had not seen any trace of Yaqui's party. Belding was convinced that Yaqui had circled around to the Devil's Road, and that Selena, Thorne, and the horses were lost in the desert. It was a common occurrence on the Camino del Diablo, and he had to break the news to Mona. She was devastated, and Mrs. Belding held her close for a long time. Eventually, Mrs. Belding opposed Belding's convictions and reminded him of his old stubborn confidence. She was sure that Yaqui was up on Diablo and John was up on Sol, and the other horses could not have been headed or caught. Miracles don't happen. But Yaqui might have gone south into some wild Sonora valley. Belding was glad to hear his mother's words and asked for her opinion. She could only repeat what he had said himself the night Selena was taken away, to trust Yaqui that he was a godsend. Perhaps he had gone south into some unknown territory. He's going to lead Rickards into a trap. He's going to find water and grass where no Mexican or American could, Belding warned his wife. "But they've been gone for 7 weeks. 7 weeks in the desert," Mona exclaimed, clearly worried. "How do the Yaquis survive out there?" she asked. Belding couldn't answer, but his wife's words gave him hope. She had a certain mystic quality that he couldn't quite understand, but he trusted her nonetheless. "Years ago, when I was searching for my father, I learned a lot about this country," Mrs. Belding began. "You never know how long a man can survive in the desert. Even the most fierce and inaccessible places can have hidden oases. My father became a prospector later in life, and he would be gone for weeks, sometimes even months. But he always came back. It wasn't until years later that he disappeared for good. I still held on to hope that he would come back, and I have that same feeling now about Yaqui and his party. I think he's given Rickards the slip or ambushed him in some trap. He's too smart to start back now over dry trails. He'll wait and curb the Rangers. I just have a feeling, dear Mona. We need to be patient and brave. John Gorman will come back to you," she assured her daughter. Mona was comforted by her mother's words and seemed to settle into a waiting patience that was both sad and serene. She had been taking violent rides and worrying herself sick, but now she had hope. She was helping her mother more than she ever had before, and she found comfort in being there for Belding. She began to take an active interest in the affairs of the growing village. Belding, who had been struggling under the weight of worry, managed to recover so that he seemed like his old self. But he knew deep down that his good mood was only a facade, and that the slow-burning anger he felt towards the Chases was quickly turning into hate. Belding argued with himself that he might have been able to reconcile with Ben Chase and his son Radford if they had been anything other than greedy, grasping, hard, cold, overbearing, and fond of drink and cards. They were developing the valley, yes, but it was clear that they only cared about themselves. Belding knew he had to shake off his lethargy and get to work if he wanted to finish everything before the hot months. He made a trip to the Sonoita oasis to make sure everything was going well along the line and to ensure there was no trace of his Rangers. Once he had completed this task, he took a number of his white thoroughbreds to Casita and shipped them to ranchers and horse breeders in Texas. Then, since he was near the railroad and had some free time, he decided to go up to Tucson. There he learned some interesting details about the Chases. They had an office in the city, influential friends in the capital, and were powerful men in the rapidly growing finance of the West. They had even managed to interest the Southern Pacific Railroad. and a new branch line would soon be constructed from San Felipe to Forlorn River. The details of the chase development were insignificant compared to a matter that hit close to home for Belding. His capability as an immigration inspector had been subtly attacked, and he suspected this was only the beginning. The chases were determined to drive him out of Forlorn River, but were taking their time to do so. Belding returned home furious, but he tried to control himself. He had a wife and daughter to think of, and the old laws of the West were no longer applicable. When Mona mentioned another Rickards in town, Belding was ready to react until she revealed it was Mr. Radford Chase. Mona teased her father about Mr. Chase's interest in her, but Belding was not amused. He had a history with the Chases, and their name made him angry. Despite his previous promise not to carry a gun, Mona reminded him of the danger, and Belding reluctantly agreed to promise again. Mona had not wanted to add to her father's worries, but she had been annoyed by Mr. Chase's persistent attention. Belding couldn't help but feel protective of his daughter and resentful towards Mr. Chase. The situation was far from resolved, and Belding knew there would be more trouble ahead. "These past 2 weeks without you have been more than just annoying. Ever since I struck Mr. Chase with my quirt, he's been doing everything in his power to meet me. He's shown up wherever I go and has even sent me countless letters, despite my efforts to send them back. I don't know if Mr. Chase grew bolder while you were away on your trips, but he certainly had more opportunities to pursue me. I couldn't stay cooped up in the house all the time. There were errands to run, sick people to tend to, and my Sunday school to attend. But every time I stepped out, Mr. Chase would be there waiting for me. He followed me everywhere, to the point where it was less embarrassing to just let him walk with me and talk my ear off. He even professed his love to me and begged me to marry him, even though I told him I was already in love and engaged. But that didn't deter him. He called me a fool and said that I should be true to a man who, according to everyone on the border, had been lost in the desert. It hurt me deeply to hear that, and it still does. That's why I've been staying in the house ever since, to avoid being hurt again. But even that doesn't stop Mr. Chase. He's a most persistent fool, to say the least. He claims to love me, but he's making me nervous. I can't sleep, and I'm afraid to be in my own room at night. I've even had to resort to sleeping in my mother's room, but even then Mr. Chase is always lurking around. He's not just bold, he's downright indecent. He bribes our servants and follows me into our patio, making the most ridiculous excuses. I think he might be crazy. I want to be charitable, but he's making it difficult. He annoys Mother to no end. I feel like a helpless little bunny trapped by a hound. I can't even peek out, Mona complained to her father, Belding. He found it amusing and let out a long laugh, which he hadn't done in a while. He only stopped when he saw Mona's hurt expression. He embraced her tightly and attempted to console her. "Don't worry, my dear, I'm just an old grizzly bear. But it tickled me, I suppose. I hope Mr. Radford Chase is smitten with you. It's the same old story, Mona. Men fall in love with you because of your beauty. It's a heavy price that women like you and Selina have to pay for their looks." "I would rather be ugly as a mud fence," Belding stated. "So would I, Dad, if only John would still love me," Mona responded. "You can bet on it that he won't, just like Laddie says," Belding replied. "The first time I catch this crazy Romeo lurking around here, I'll—" "Dad, you promised," Mona interrupted. "Bother it, Mona, I only promised not to carry a gun, that's all. I'll only shoo him off the property gently, mind you. I'll leave the rest to John Gorman," Belding exclaimed. "Oh, Dad!" Mona cried. She hugged him tightly, a mixture of fear and sadness in her eyes. "Don't misunderstand me, Mona. You usually have your way. You deceive your mother and manipulate me. However, with John Gorman you can't do either. You're kind-hearted and you overlook Mr. Chase's actions. But when John returns, be prepared for a little pandemonium in the Chase household. Oh, he'll find out. And I definitely want to be there when John gives Mr. Radford the same treatment he gave Rickards," Belding warned. Belding remained vigilant for young Chase, but he later discovered that both the father and son had gone on one of their frequent trips to Casa Grande, where their mines were located a few days later. As April drew to a close, May quickly took its place. One morning Belding was interrupted from his gardening by the sound of an automobile and a loud greeting. Upon walking to the front yard, he noticed a car that resembled one he had seen in Casita. The driver looked familiar, but the three figures in gray coats and veils were strangers to him. As they removed their dusty veils, Belding observed an elderly man with a sallow complexion, a beautiful woman with dark eyes and white hair, and a stunningly built girl who reminded him of John Gorman. The gentleman politely asked if Belding was the inspector of immigration, and Belding confirmed that he was. The man then introduced himself as John Gorman's father, the governor, and introduced the two women with him as John's mother and sister, Elsie. Belding was overjoyed to meet them and eagerly shook their hands. Mr. Gorman explained that he had come to the West to search for his missing son, as they had not heard from him in months and Elsie's letters had gone unanswered. Belding's slow mind began to process the information, and he informed them that John had been away for quite some time, but he was expecting him back any day. He invited them inside to rest and make themselves comfortable, assuring them that they could stay until John returned. Belding's mother and sister Mona would take care of them and handle their baggage. Belding was convinced that John would be back in no time. Excitement pulsed through Belding as he welcomed the Gales into his sitting room, introducing them to his wife and daughter. They were all taken aback by the unexpected visitors, something that had never happened to Belding before. He couldn't help but feel a bit flustered himself, surprised by his own reaction. After showing the Gales to their rooms, Mrs. Belding regained her composure, but Mona came rushing back in, more frenzied than usual. Mona whispered to her father about John's mother and sister, leaving out any mention of his father. She was convinced that they were wealthy and important people, and she was nervous about their opinion of her, especially since she was wearing John's mother's ring. Belding watched as Mona ran off to make herself presentable, and then he turned to his wife, who had a look of apprehension on her face. He sat there, pondering the complex emotions of the women in his life. Women, he thought, were creatures of feeling, and he knew better than to try to understand them. Belding was overjoyed to host John's family, and he had no troubling thoughts at the time. When the Gales returned to the sitting room without their long gray cloaks and veils, Belding saw that they had an air of distinction and elegance. Mr. Gorman appeared to be a grave and troubled person, struggling with illness and mental distress. Belding sensed that he was a man of authority, much like Ben Chase had been, but without any harshness. Mrs. Gorman, on the other hand, frightened Belding for reasons he couldn't explain. The girl, however, reminded him of John in his younger days. As they conversed, Belding thought that it would be best to tell the Gales about John's engagement to Mona as soon as possible. He saw the faint perception of the ordeal it was for her to appear well in front of John's family. However, he was kept busy answering questions about the border and forlorn river that he couldn't find an opening to tell them the news. Despite his interest in the West, Mr. Gorman was most concerned about his son's well-being. He was broken in health and had worried himself sick over John. "We had a quarrel, sir, I won't deny it. I laughed at his threats, and he stormed out of my sight. It's taken me some time to realize that I didn't really know Richard at all. I was wrong to berate him like I did. It's been a year since we've heard from him, and it's been almost 6 months since anyone's heard a word. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Belding, I was the first to weaken. I've come to find him, but my fear is that I may have waited too long. That boy is destined for great things, and I should never have let him wander around this wild country for so long. I had hoped he would find his own way, but now I'm afraid he's gone to the bad." Mr. Gorman paused and raised his hand, shaking it expressively. Belding was quick to pick up on the tension in the air. He knew there was more at play than just a simple missing person. "Well, Mr. Gorman, it's not uncommon for young men from the East to go astray out here," he said bluntly. "I've heard that," replied Mr. Gorman, a hint of sadness in his voice. "Blow their money, take to whiskey, gambling, lose their jobs." Belding listed off the common pitfalls. "Yes," Mr. Gorman agreed, nodding weakly. "Then it's bumming around, becoming tramps, and generally going to the bad," Belding finished, spreading his arms wide. Mona, who sat beside him, squeezed his hand tightly. "It's the regular thing," he stated almost cheerfully. He couldn't help but feel a little bit of glee at Mr. Gorman's distress, but the look in John's sister's eyes was too much for him. He choked off his usual string of expletives and blurted out, "But John Gorman never went to the bad." "Listen," Belding exclaimed. He had barely begun John Gorman's story when he realized he had never before had such an attentive audience. As Belding recounted the tale, they were awed and speechless by the end. John Gorman's arrival in Casita, his rescue of Selina, and his life as a border ranger were told in great detail, with no shortage of daring or noble acts. Belding only held back his concerns for John's safety in the present moment. John's sister was the first to speak. "Oh, Father," she cried, eyes shining. "I always knew John was a true man." Mr. Gorman stood up from his chair, unsteady on his feet. His frailty was now apparent. "Mr. Belding, are you telling us that my son Richard Gorman has done all that you've described?" he asked incredulously. "I sure am," replied Belding with enthusiasm. "Martha, can you believe it?" Mr. Gorman turned to his wife, but she was still too stunned to reply. "He faced down a bandit and his gang all by himself? He fought them?" Mr. Gorman demanded, his voice getting stronger. "John took care of the whole bunch," Belding exclaimed, grinning. "And he rescued a Spanish girl, too. He went out into the desert without food, weapons, anything but his own 2 hands. And all this from Richard Gorman, whose hands were always useless." Belding nodded. "He's a ranger now, riding, fighting, and sleeping on the sand. He even prepares his own food." "Well, I'll be," Mr. Gorman said almost to himself. "And he takes care of his horse with his own hands, too?" Belding was fired up at the mention of the horse. "Does John care for his horse? Let me tell you, there are few men who love their horses as much as John loves Blanco's soul. That's Mex for white son, Mr. Gorman. Wait till you all lay eyes on Blanco's soul. He's the whitest, biggest, strongest, fastest, and grandest horse in all of the Southwest," exclaimed Belding to John Gorman's father. "You mean to tell me my son is in love with a horse? I hardly recognize him anymore," replied Mr. Gorman. Belding, who employed John, proudly stated, "Richard makes $40 a month plus board and outfit." $40 a month, is that by the day or week?" questioned Mr. Gorman in disbelief. Belding responded, "By the month, of course." John's father was astonished. $40 a month for a young man who spent $500 in the same amount of time when he was in college and ran it into thousands when he graduated. "However," Belding explained, "he saves it. John's engaged to marry my stepdaughter, Mona Edwards." Mona blushed at the mention of her name, and John's mother and sister looked at her intently. Belding realized he had made an error by not informing them of John's relation to Mona. Mona showed her ring to them, confirming their engagement. Miss Gorman warmly responded, "Congratulations, Miss Edwards. John's a lucky man to have you." "I'm going to be so damn happy," she said, planting a kiss on Mona's lips. "Miss Edwards, we're learning some damn amazing stuff about Richard," Mr. Gorman chimed in, his voice full of earnestness and shaking with emotion. "If you had anything to do with making him a man, then God bless you. My dear girl, I ain't really taken a good look at you. Richard's fiancé. Mom, we still ain't found him yet, but I reckon we done found his secret. We thought he was a lost cause, but here's his sweetheart." Only then did the proud and haughty expression on Mrs. Gorman's face break, revealing a mixture of pain and joy. She opened her arms wide, and Mona let out a strange, choked cry before flying into them. Belding suddenly realized his vision was blurry. He couldn't see perfectly, and that was why he wasn't sure if Mrs. Belding's face was as sad and pale as it appeared when she entered the sitting room. Chapter 18. John Gorman sat in shock as he stared down into the deep purple abyss where Rickards had fallen to his death. The Yaqui stood still on the steep red lava wall where he had cut off the bandits' escape route. Selina lay motionless on the ground where she had fallen. Suddenly the Indian let out a strange, wild cry that echoed across the chasm. Then a deafening silence overtook the area, filling the air with an eerie stillness. As the sun began to set, the haze thickened and turned a deep shade of red. The Yaqui's movements broke the spell that had held Gorman frozen in place. He watched as the wounded Indian slowly crawled and slipped his way back towards the ledge, taking frequent rests along the way. Despite his injuries, the Yaqui refused to give up. As he finally made it to the ledge where Selina was lying, Gorman leapt to his feet, feeling empowered and ready to take on the responsibility that had been placed upon him. Without hesitation, he turned to where Thorne was lying, just regaining consciousness. Gorman quickly fetched a canteen and helped Thorne wash his face, making him drink some water. The look in Thorne's eyes was almost unbearable, but Gorman knew he had to stay strong. Thorne, everything's all right now," he cried out in a piercing voice. "Selina is safe. Yaqui saved her. Rickards is finished." Yaqui jumped down the wall and chased the bandit off the ledge, inch by inch, foot by foot. "We've won the battle, Thorne." These words were like a shot of adrenaline for Thorne. The dark fear and despair in his eyes began to fade away, and he started to feel hopeful again. He got up, a bit dizzy but still standing on his own, and looked over at the crater. Yaki had made it to Selina and was tending to her. She stirred, and Yaki helped her up. She seemed weak and unable to stand on her own, but she waved her hand across the crater to let them know she was unharmed. Thorn raised both arms above his head and let out a cry that was not quite a call or a shout or a greeting or a response. It was a sound that could hardly be described, but it was deep, husky, and incredibly powerful. It sent shivers down Gorman's spine and made his heart race. Selina waved her hand again, and Yaki signaled urgently to them. Gorman quickly gathered their canteen and rifles and wrapped an arm around Thorn. "Come on, old man, can you walk? Of course you can walk. Lean on me and we'll get out of here in no time. Don't look over there. Watch your step. We don't have much time before it gets dark." "Oh, Thorn, I'm afraid Jim might not have made it. And the last time I saw Laddie, he was badly hurt." Gorman was on high alert, ready for anything. He was a man of many talents. Once they left the rough and jagged lava trail, Gorman had no trouble keeping up with Thorn and also keeping his eyes peeled for danger. "Hey, Thorn, what's that?" Gorman asked, stopping as they reached a point where the trail descended through the rugged lava. Suddenly a strange noise broke the silence, one that was almost unimaginable given the time and place. A voice was chanting, "Turn the lady, turn the lady, turn, Alaman left, all swing, turn the lady, turn." "Hey, Jim!" shouted Gorman, pulling Thorn around the bend in the lava. "Where are you? Holy cow, I thought you were dead. I'm so glad to see you. Are you okay? Did you get hurt?" Jim Lash stood in the middle of the trail, leaning on the butt of his rifle, which he was using as a makeshift crutch. He was pale but had a smile on his face. His hands were covered in blood, and he had a scarf tightly wrapped around his left leg just above the knee. His leg hung limply, and his foot dragged behind him. "I reckon I'm not hurt too bad," Jim replied. "But my leg hurts like hell, if you want to know." "Where's Laddie?" Gorman asked. "He's just across the crack there. I was trying to get to him. We had a pretty intense fight down here. Laddie was shot up pretty badly before he tried to cut off Rickards from the trail. John, did you see the Yaki go after Rickards?" "Did I?" exclaimed Gorman, his face darkening. "I almost lost my mind when I saw that. You see, I was closer to where Selina was hiding than you were. When Rickards and his last henchman started to cross, Laddie went after them, but I couldn't follow. Laddie took care of Rickards' partner and then went down himself. But he got back up and fell again, over and over. He kept doing that until he collapsed for good. I think it's unlikely we'll find him alive. Listen up, fellas. Rickards was determined to cause trouble, and Selina was ready to fight back. I witnessed her shoot him, but it didn't seem to slow him down. My heart was pounding as Selina and Rickards battled on the cliff, and then came the end, a feat only a Yaki could have accomplished. Did you see it, Thorn?" "I was out of commission," replied the cavalryman. "It's a shame. That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen." "Thorn, you're looking pretty good. How about you, John? Is he badly hurt?" "No, he's not. He took a hard hit to the head and has a scalp wound," replied John. "Here, Jim, let me help you over this rough terrain." Gorman carefully guided the injured men down the uneven slope and across a narrow lava bridge over a fissure. He left them to rest while he went to search for Laddie. Gorman found the ranger lying face down, a bloody hand clutching a gun. At first he thought Laddie was dead, but upon closer inspection he found he was still alive, although badly wounded. Gorman carried him back to the others. "He's alive, but barely," said John as he laid the ranger down. "Do what you can to stop the bleeding. Laddie's tough as a cactus. I'll go back for Selina and the Yaki." Gorman ran along the trail, nimble as a mountain sheep. When he found the Mexican, Rickards's last ally, he saw the devastating power of the .405. Gorman didn't hesitate. He made quick work of the descent, but was cautious on the treacherous slope leading to the ledge. Soon he came upon Selina and the Yaki. She ran into John's arms, her strength and courage finally giving way. "Selina, you're safe. Thorn is safe, too. It's all over now," John reassured her. "Rickards," she whispered. "He's gone, to the bottom of the crater. It's the Yaki's revenge, Selina," the girl whispered, invoking the name of the Virgin. Without hesitation, the man gathered her in his arms and commanded the Yaki to follow. The Indian grunted, clutching a bloody wound on his shoulder, but Gorman knew it didn't faze him. Together they carefully navigated the treacherous terrain, moving slowly in some places, quickly in others, until they reached the top. There they found Jim Lash and Miller, the latter appearing near death. Selina greeted Thorne calmly, which surprised Gorman, but he himself remained composed. Miller smiled weakly at him, but was unable to speak. Yaki joined the group, his eyes darting from one person to another, lingering longest on Miller. Jim spoke up. "John, it's up to you and Selina now. I'm almost done for. Bring blankets, water, salt, and firewood. Laddie's got a slim chance. Fix him up first. Use hot salt water. If my leg is broken, set it as best you can. Yaki's wound won't bother him for long. Thorne is badly hurt." Jim's voice trailed off and he lay back, his breathing ragged. Gorman examined Jim's leg, confirming that it wasn't broken before rising to gather the supplies. He instructed Selina to cradle Thorne's head in her lap and then set off down the trail. Yaki followed despite Gorman's command for him to stay back. As Gorman trudged up the trail, he fell behind his companion, who was faster and more nimble. The setting sun cast a warm light on the path, making the descent to the arroyo easy. Some of the white horses had come in for a drink, and Blanco Sol spotted Gorman, whistled, and galloped over to him. Twilight had settled in by the time they reached the arroyo. Yaki had already started gathering mesquite sticks. Gorman quickly gathered what he needed and packed it all up in a tarpaulin. He then turned to go back up the trail. The darkness was creeping in, and the narrow, steep trail in some places was perilous. Gorman's burden wasn't heavy, but it was bulky and unsteady, frequently knocking against the trail's rocky side. He needed to wait for Yaki to lead the way. The Indian seemed to have eyes that could see just as well at night as during the day. Gorman carried the pack up the slope, shouldering, swinging, and dragging it for what felt like an eternity. Finally, they reached the spot where Selina and the injured men were waiting. Gorman got to work immediately. Yaki kept the fire going, and Selina assisted Gorman in any way she could. Miller had many wounds, but none were fatal. Gorman worked quickly to stop the bleeding, and Miller remained unconscious throughout the procedure. According to Jim Lash, Miller had a slim chance of survival, but Gorman was more optimistic, putting his odds at 1 in 1,000. After finishing with Miller, Gorman tended to Lash, who had a large bullet wound in his leg. Gorman couldn't be certain whether the bullet had hit any bones, but he didn't think it was serious. Jim let out a pained groan as the hot salt water was applied to his wounds. Once he was bandaged up, Gorman moved on to Miller, who was lying beside him. Thorne was barely conscious and extremely weak, with a deep gash in his scalp that had been tended to by Selina. However, she fainted after dressing the wound. Gorman placed her and the 3 injured men in a row and covered them with blankets and a tarpaulin. He then tended to Yaki, who had been shot in the shoulder. Despite Yaki's claims that it was just a flea bite, Gorman believed it to be a serious wound. After bandaging him, Gorman instructed Yaki to rest by the fire, where Gorman stood guard and tended to it with minimal wood. As time passed, Gorman felt strangely calm, despite the severity of the situation. He monitored the 5 injured individuals, wondering if any of them would ever wake up. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, with the air growing colder and the silence becoming more intense. The fire eventually died out, leaving Gorman in the dark and damp as dawn approached. As the sun rose, Gorman knew that he was faced with a great problem. At first he hesitated, holding himself back as he approached the sleeping figures, but he couldn't help the stern force that pushed him forward. As he drew closer, Yaki stirred and woke up, casting a quick glance his way. Though he didn't smile, a glimmer of light passed over his dark face. His shoulder seemed stiff, but otherwise he seemed to be himself. Selina was in a deep slumber, while Thorne was feverish and restless. Miller appeared barely alive, but Jim Lash slept soundly despite his wound. Gorman's mood broke sharply as he realized that as long as Thorne and Miller were alive, there was hope for them. He woke Selina up, and the first thing he noticed was the wonder and beauty in her eyes. But then her expression darkened as she realized the gravity of their situation. "We've got a job on our hands," he told her. "Laddie is alive, Thorne's not so bad. You must help me." She got up and bent over Thorne, laying her hands on his hot face. Then she rose, a woman who seemed born for moments of crisis. Gorman carefully picked up Miller and motioned for Selina to follow him. "Bring what you can carry," he said. "Yaki, stay here." He carried Miller down the slope with Selina right behind him. He felt the strain on his strength as he picked up Thorne and started down the trail, but he didn't falter. He laid Thorne next to Miller and left Selina to tend to them. As he trudged up the steep rocky steps, John was drenched in sweat and struggling to catch his breath. Suddenly a voice called out to him. It was Jim Lash, who was sitting up and looking surprisingly alert. "Hey there, John. I woke up a little late this morning. Where's Laddie?" John hesitated for a moment before responding. "Well, Laddie's alive for starters, but we've got bigger problems to worry about. Where's Thorne and Selina?" Jim looked confused. "What's going on, man? You're not seriously planning on carrying this whole crew down that treacherous trail, are you?" John shook his head. "I had to, Jim. The sun would have killed them within an hour. Now come on, let's go." Jim's usual laid-back attitude was replaced with concern as he struggled to get to his feet. "You're a strong guy, John, but you're not a horse. Can you get me a crutch and help me down?" John didn't have time for this, but he knew Jim was right. He found a crutch and helped Jim down the trail, with Yaki following behind with some of the camp equipment. It was a grueling journey, with Jim's weight taking a toll on John's already exhausted body, but they finally made it to the arroyo. After a short break, John went back up the trail to retrieve the rest of the camp equipment. He was determined to fight for Thorne's life, even though Miller's case seemed hopeless. For the next 2 days, John and the others watched over Thorne, doing everything they could to keep him alive. It was a laborious task, but John hardly noticed the time passing. When he finally gave in to his own exhaustion, he felt like only a few hours had passed. By then, Yaki had recovered from his injury and was able to help with some of the tasks. Despite their tireless efforts, Thorne's condition remained critical, but John refused to give up, even as his own strength waned. After getting some much-needed rest, Gorman relieved Selina of the duty of caring for Thorne, which she had stubbornly refused to let go of until then. Thorne had developed a high fever, and Gorman feared that he had blood poisoning, so he needed constant care. His condition worsened slowly, and there was a day when Gorman thought it was the end for Thorne. But the day passed, as did the night and the following day, and Thorne miraculously survived, though he was still in a terrible state. Selina was devoted to his care, becoming pale, absorbed, and silent. Gorman was amazed and grateful when Thorne's fever finally abated, and some of the inflammation disappeared. The next morning, Thorne was conscious, and Gorman finally allowed Selina to take a break while he cared for Thorne himself. He realized that Thorne's chance of recovery depended on the quality of his care, which gave him hope. Jim Lash's wound healed without complications, and he was expected to recover the use of his leg in due time. However, Miller's condition seemed to worsen day by day, as if he was fading away. His wounds remained open, bleeding a little all the time, both internally and externally, without clotting or closing. Gorman reluctantly agreed to let Yaki care for Miller, despite his doubts about the Indian's ability to save him. Yaki disappeared from the camp for a while, but when he returned, he had some desert plants that were unknown to Gorman. He used them to make a potent ointment. After removing Miller's bandages, he applied a mixture to his wounds. He then allowed the wounds to be exposed to the air while covering them at night. The next day, the wounds were exposed to warm, dry air, which helped them slowly close. Miller stopped bleeding externally. Time passed, and Gorman thought weeks had gone by. Yaki had fully recovered, and Jim Lash was now able to move around with the help of a crutch. Thorne, on the other hand, was a mere ghost of his former self. Selina's eyes were always on him, and he looked haggard and emaciated. Meanwhile, Miller seemed to linger and linger. His bullet-pierced body refused to give up its life. He became a skeleton of his former self and could barely move or speak. However, he was still conscious and recognized those who cared for him. They gave him nothing but water, but he clung on to life tenaciously. Gorman believed it was Yaki's spirit that kept him alive. Yaki was always by Miller's side, and his eyes burned with a strange intensity. Days passed, and Miller was given thin nourishment. Finally, he regained the use of his tongue, and his first words were characteristic of a ranger. He said, "Sure, this is hell." Everyone who heard it smiled, but their eyes were wet. Miller slowly regained his strength, but progress was so slow that only those with hope in their hearts could see it. Jim Lash threw away his crutch, and Thorne recovered before Miller could even lift his arm or turn his head. However, Miller's whispers grew stronger, and a long, immovable gloom that had been on his face lifted. Gorman, who was always the pessimist, finally threw his doubts aside and believed that the ranger would recover. This was a moment of great joy for Gorman, as he felt like his old self again. He was filled with gratitude, humility, and awe, and the fear that had been weighing on him disappeared. He wanted to thank Selina, Thorne, Lash, Miller, and even the Yaqui, who had become a remarkable figure. He thought of his home and his wife Mona, and the red slopes that had once seemed so terrifying now felt less ominous. Miller called out to the boys, Selina and the Yaqui, to gather round. He was lying in the shade of a brush shelter, propped up on a pillow. His thin frame made him look almost skeletal, but his eyes were sharp, thoughtful, and kind. "Can anyone tell me what day and month it is?" he asked. No one knew the answer. Gorman was surprised by the question, and the others seemed equally puzzled. Miller then pointed to a cactus nearby, a saguaro with a few withered white flowers hanging from its column. "I reckon it's the end of March, judging by that giant cactus," said Jim Lash somberly. "It's definitely April," replied Gorman. "Look at the position of the sun and feel how hot it's getting." Lash then asked, "What if it is April?" "It's about time you all hit the trail back to Forlorn River before the water holes dry up," said Miller. "Laddie, we'll start as soon as you're able to be put on a horse," replied one of his companions. "Sure, that'll be too late," Miller responded. The others looked at him in silence, unsure of what he meant. Lash, who had a lame leg, shifted uneasily and moistened his lips. "Charlie Miller, are you saying we should ride off and leave you here?" asked another companion. "What else is there to do? The hot weather is coming, and soon most of the water holes will be dry." "You can't travel then," Miller explained. "I'm on my back here, and God only knows when I could be packed out. Not for weeks, maybe. I'll never be any good again, even if I get out alive." Miller went on to explain that leaving someone behind in the desert was not uncommon and sometimes necessary. If they waited too long, they might all end up like him. "I'm all in. What's the sense of you waiting here when it means the old desert story?" Miller asked. "Go now, and maybe you'll get home. If you wait on a chance of taking me, you'll be too late. Pretty soon this lava will be one roasting hell." Despite Miller's plea, Lash was not willing to leave him behind. However, Gorman, another companion, seemed to understand Miller's situation and agreed to leave him with Yaqui and a couple of horses. Miller pleaded with them to go, reminding them of Mona, who was waiting for them back at Forlorn River. In the end, they left Miller behind, hoping to make it back to civilization before the water holes dried up. Imagine what it means to her. She's a truly amazing woman, John. Who are you to break her heart for an old worn-out cowboy? Just think about how she's waiting for you with that sweet, sad face and troubled eyes that turned black. Will you go, son? John shook his head. The ranger then turned to Thorne, and his sharp, gleaming eyes had become blurred. "Thorne, it's different for you. Jim's a fool, and young Gorman has been pricked by cholla thorns. He's got the desert poison in his blood. But you have no reason to stay. You can find that trail easily. It's been made by so many shod horses. Take your wife and go. Will you go, Thorne?" Deliberately and without hesitation, the cavalryman replied, "No." Miller then turned to Selina. His face was convulsed, and though his voice had sunk to a whisper, it was clear and beautiful with a rich quality that Gorman had never heard before. "Selina, you're a woman. You're the woman we fought for, and some of us will surely die for you. Don't make it all for nothing. Let us feel that we saved you. You can make Thorne go. He'll have to go if you say so. They'll all have to go. Think of the years of love and happiness that lie ahead of you. In a week or so it'll be too late. Can you bear the thought of me seeing you like that? Let me tell you, Selina, when the summer heat hits the lava, we'll all wither and curl up like shavings near a fire. A wind of hell will blow up this slope. Look at those mesquites. See the twist in them. That's what the heat and thirst can do. Do you want me or any of us to see you like that? Selina, don't make it all for nothing. Come on, Selina, please convince Thorne to help us," pleaded Gorman. Despite his desperate plea, Selina remained unmoved. Her heart was as hard as the surrounding lava, and she refused to budge. "Never!" she exclaimed, her face white and her black eyes flashing. Gorman suspected that Miller had a sinister purpose in mind, and to his surprise, Lash shared the same suspicion. They made sure that Miller never had access to a gun. As time passed, the somber spell lifted from Miller's mind, and he began to gather strength daily. His appetite couldn't be satisfied, and he was eager to get well. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the water in the lava hole continued to sink. The Yaqui was the only one who remained active during the waiting time. He made trips up the lava slope and returned with guns, boots, sombreros, and other items belonging to the bandits that had fallen. However, he never brought back a saddle or bridle, leading the rangers to conclude that Rickard's horses had long since taken their back trail. As Miller improved, he had to hear the story of Rickard's demise every day. Despite its morbid fascination, he reveled in it and tortured Selina. His gentleness and consideration, which were once so marked, were now in abeyance to some sinister, ghastly joy. Selina reluctantly indulged him by reliving the harrowing moments of her encounter with Rickard on the ledge, the moment she shot him, the moment she almost threw herself off the cliff, and the moment she fought him off. Miller derived pleasure from Thorne's vivid retelling of the events and from Gorman's first-hand account of the tragedy. Jim Lash never tired of recounting the gruesome details, convinced that it satisfied the ranger's thirst for vengeance. In the evenings, as the campfire flickered, Miller would try to coax the Yaqui into sharing his side of the story, but the Indian remained silent, his eyes and face betraying nothing. Days turned into weeks as they waited for Miller to recover. Slowly he regained his strength and was soon able to walk around. He even declared that he could endure the journey to Forlorn River strapped to a horse. The rangers rejoiced and eagerly made plans to leave. But when they informed the Yaqui of their intentions, he refused to accompany them. He explained that they had waited too long. The smaller waterholes along the trail had dried up, and the summer heat was unbearable. Death awaited them in the burning valley, whereas they had water, grass, wood, shade, and sheep to sustain them in their current location. The water would last, barring the occurrence of the dreaded ano seco, a drought that plagued the Mexicans. "Wait for the rain," Yaqui confidently declared, now speaking with a commanding tone like never before. "If we don't get any rain," he paused and raised his hand silently. The group fell quiet, waiting for him to continue. Yaqui continued, "We won't be able to cross the river. The water will be too low and we'll get stuck in the mud." His words were met with nods of agreement from the others around the campfire. The group had been traveling for days, trying to make it to their destination before the rainy season began. They had already faced many obstacles, including bandits and harsh terrain. But now the weather threatened to be their greatest challenge. The river they needed to cross was known for being treacherous, and without enough water it could become impossible to navigate. Yaqui and the others knew they needed to wait for the rain. They set up camp and prepared for the long wait. Days turned into weeks, and the sky remained dry. The group began to worry that they would never be able to cross the river. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the first drops of rain fell from the sky. The group rejoiced, knowing that their journey could finally continue. The rain continued to pour down, turning the dry landscape into a muddy mess. But the group pressed on, determined to reach their destination no matter what. Through perseverance and determination, they finally made it across the river and arrived at their destination. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had overcome every obstacle in their path, and they knew that they could face anything as long as they stuck together and waited for the rain. Chapter 19. The desert was a harsh mistress, and Gorman knew it all too well. What might have seemed like a terrible situation from the comfort of a faraway home was now a reality that they had to accept. He looked around at the others, Selina included, and saw no hint of regret or longing for the life they had left behind. If they thought about loved ones, they kept it to themselves. Selina remained the same as ever, a strong and capable woman who seemed to draw her strength from the desert itself. Gorman had always marveled at her ability to adapt to this harsh landscape, to thrive where others would wither away. He had trained himself to do the same, to fight against the primitive instincts that threatened to overwhelm him at every turn. It was a constant battle, but one that he had to wage if he wanted to survive. Drifting through the desert was both easy and hard at the same time. It was easy to forget about the past, to leave it all behind and embrace the freedom of the open desert. But it was also hard to remember, to hold on to the memories that made them who they were. Gorman knew that a man with a great wrong or passion might find solace in this lonely place, but for a normal person like him, it was a challenge to resist the pull of the natural world and hold on to the civilization that had shaped him. In the absence of any other clear leader, Miller stepped up to take charge once again. He was a man of great strength and determination, someone who would take on the responsibility of leading the group even if it wasn't given to him. In moments of danger or uncertainty, everyone looked to Miller for guidance, and he never failed to provide it. Miller's first request was to lay out the remaining food supply on a tarpaulin. It was clear that the supply was slim. The ranger stood for a while examining it, recalling his days on the range and in the desert to determine what could be useful for their current situation. It was difficult to gauge Miller's expression, as he still looked like a corpse, but the slow shake of his head gave Gorman an idea. However, there was a glimmer of hope when Miller touched the bags of salt and exclaimed, "It was smart to pack all that salt." He then turned to his companions and spoke, "That's not a lot of food for 6 starving people stuck in the desert. But the food isn't what worries me. Yaki can get a sheep from the slopes. Water, that's what we need, and it's our only concern." "Laddie, I don't think this waterhole ever dries up," Jim replied. "Ask the Indian." Yaki repeated his warning about the Mexicans' dreaded ano seco. In a dry year, the waterhole would dry up. "John, take a rope and see how deep the water is," Miller ordered. Gorman couldn't find the bottom with a 30-foot lasso. The water was sweet, cool, and clear, as if it had been stored in a shaded iron container. Miller was delighted and surprised by this news. "Let's see. Last year was pretty dry. Maybe this summer won't be. Maybe we'll get lucky." "Ask Yaki if he thinks it will rain," Miller said. Selina questioned the Indian. "He says no one can say for sure, but he thinks it will rain," she replied. "It will rain, you can bet on that now," Miller continued. "If we can only find grass for the horses. We can't leave without them. John, take Yaki and scout down the arroyo. I saw the horses getting fat today." "This desert's making me chunky. Maybe the horses have eaten up all the grass," grumbled Gorman. "Go check it out, John, and I hope you come back with good news." Gorman had never ventured far down the arroyo, and the Yaki's assurance that there was grass for the horses had sufficed until now. As he explored the widening arroyo, Gorman noted that the narrow head was lined with grass, but it tapered out as the stream bed expanded. The arroyo must flood during heavy rainfall, he surmised, given the lush vegetation and gnarled mesquites and palo verdes. The gray grass was dotted everywhere, but the horses were nowhere to be seen until Gorman reached the sand dunes. Blanco Diablo and Sol greeted him with whinnies and tossed manes. The oasis was teeming with enough grass to feed many horses. Miller and the others were waiting for Gorman's report with bated breath. They received it calmly, but with unmistakable joy. Gorman couldn't help but notice how their eyes turned to the only woman in the group. "Do you think we'll make it, Signor Laddie?" she asked, her voice shaking with hope. "Selina, no one can predict what'll happen out here in the desert," Miller replied. "But I have more hope now than I've had in a long time. The Indian saved my life, and now we have a chance to survive. Strange thoughts have been crossing my mind about Yaki. I can't quite comprehend them. At first glance, he appears to be a filthy, resentful, and vindictive savage. But that's far from the truth. Maybe Yaki isn't like most Indians. However, he looks like one. It's possible that the issue is with us white folks who never truly knew the Indian. Nonetheless, Belden was right. Yaki is our savior. As for the future, I wish to know, just like you, if we'll ever be able to return home. But being who I am, I say, who knows? Nevertheless, something tells me that Yaki knows the answer. Ask him, Selina, make him reveal it. We'll all benefit from knowing. We'll be stronger if we have more faith in him. He's a silent Indian, but make him speak." Selina called out to Yaki. Whenever she spoke, there was always an indication of urgency that was otherwise absent from his actions. She placed a hand on his strong, bare arm and began speaking in Spanish. Her voice was swift, low, full of profound emotions, and as sweet as the ringing of a bell. It moved Gorman, even though he barely understood what she was saying. He didn't need a translation to sense that she expressed a woman's desire for life, love, home, and the inheritance of a woman's heart. Gorman had his doubts about his own interpretation. He thought that the Yaki comprehended this woman's yearning. In Gorman's vision, the Indian's stoicism, his enigmatic nature, and the hardness of his face, although unchanging, seemed to radiate light, tenderness, and loyalty. Gorman had a fleeting glimpse, but he couldn't hold on to the beautiful, elusive thing. "Sa," the Indian responded with authority and profundity. Selina took a deep breath, and her hand reached out for thorns. "He said yes," she whispered. He replied that he would save us. He knows how to take us all back. The Indian turned to his tasks, and the group's silence was eventually broken by Miller. "Of course," I said confidently, "all we need is some common sense. As the commissary department of this outfit, I make the decisions when it comes to food. You all will only eat when I say it's time. It may not be too difficult to keep our health. Starving beggars don't get sick. However, with the heat coming, we could all go crazy. That's our biggest problem. If only you all had a passion for checkers, I could make a board and force you to play. Thorne, you're a lucky man. You have your girl with you, and this could be your honeymoon. With a few tools and some materials, you can build a grand house for your wife. John, you're also lucky. You love to hunt, and up there you'll find the best bighorn hunting in the West. Take Yaki and the .405. We need the meat, but also have some fun. This opportunity won't come around twice. I wish we were all able to go, but some men can't climb the lava. However, you'll be able to see some beautiful country from the peaks. There's nowhere wilder on Earth except for the poles. When you're older, you and Mona, with a couple of fine boys, can tell them all about being lost in the lava and hunting sheep with Yaki. This is your chance to go out hunting and get lost in thought. If I had a girl like Mona, I'd never go crazy. That's your game, John. Hunt and think of Mona and how you'll tell those fine boys about it all, including the old cowman laddie who will have long passed the divide by then. Get excited now, son. You'll need it for yourself and for us." Gorman made his way up the lava slope, circling around to the right of the arroyo, following an ancient Papago trail that Yaki had pointed out. As they made their way through the jagged, spiky, and uneven terrain covered in a silver sheen of cholla cactus, Gorman and Yaki kept a keen lookout for any signs of sheep. The lava rocks were hot, and the sun blazed down on them mercilessly, making the already treacherous path seem even more difficult. The Yaqui, with his sharp eyes and falcon-like gaze, scoured the horizon for any signs of movement, while Gorman used his binoculars to scan the steep inclines of the rocky terrain. Despite the heat and the difficult terrain, they continued on, their eyes fixed on the vast expanse of canyons, ridges, and gullies that lay before them. The landscape was dotted with chollas and other white bushes, and occasionally a towering green cactus would punctuate the barren terrain. It was a harsh and unforgiving land, but one that held a certain beauty. As they crested a steep ridge, Yaki suddenly stopped and crawled behind a rocky outcropping. From this vantage point, he could see a group of 5 sheep grazing in a nearby gully. They were larger than Gorman had expected, with dull brown coats, and 2 of them sported impressive curved horns. Gorman was amazed at how far-sighted these animals were, as he was certain they had spotted the hunters. Without hesitation, Yaki took a red scarf and a mesquite branch from his pack and fashioned a makeshift flag. He stuck the branch into a crack in the lava, and the scarf fluttered in the hot breeze. Gorman watched as Yaki once again trained his binoculars on the sheep. The hunt was on. All 5 of them stood still like statues, their heads facing the gully in front of them. They were over a mile away, and without his binoculars, Gorman could hardly make them out from the rough terrain. He was extremely intrigued. Did the sheep spot the red scarf? It was hard to believe, but nothing else could explain their motionless alertness. The sheep held this position for about 15 minutes. Then the leading ram started making its way towards them, followed by the others. He took a few steps forward, then stopped, always with his head up and nose pointed. "By George, they're coming!" exclaimed Gorman. "They see that flag. They're after us. They're curious. I'm amazed." The Indian grunted, indicating he understood. Gorman struggled to contain his eagerness. The sheep were moving slowly towards them. The leader's approach and pauses were remarkably regular. He moved like a machine. Gorman followed him down the opposite wall, around holes, across gullies, and over ridges. He then shifted his binoculars to see where the others were. They were also moving at the same pace and pausing as their leader. What agile creatures they were, so nimble and sure-footed. It was exhilarating to watch them. Gorman forgot he had a rifle. The Yaqui pressed his heavy hand down on Gorman's shoulder. He had to keep quiet and stay hidden. Gorman suddenly thought that the sheep might come all the way over to investigate the puzzling red object fluttering in the breeze. It would be a strange sight indeed for the wildest creatures on Earth. The big ram continued leading with the same steady persistence, and in half an hour he was at the bottom of the great gulf, and soon he was facing up the slope. Gorman then realized that the captivating scarf had lured him. It was no longer necessary for him to use his binoculars. There was a brief period when a crest of lava obstructed the view of the sheep. For about 15 minutes, Gorman kept his eyes on the two rams and their smaller followers. He was certain they would appear again soon, so he waited with anticipation. Suddenly, Yaki's hand tightened on Gorman's arm, signaling that the sheep were in sight again. Gorman moved cautiously to get a better view of the sheep. He couldn't believe the size of the leader. It seemed like he was all horns. However, after a while, Gorman noticed that the sheep was graceful, sinewy, slender, powerfully built, and in poise magnificent. The second ram soon joined the leader on the mound, and the other three followed suit. It was a beautiful sight, and Gorman realized that they were even more wonderful than Miller had described. However, Gorman's admiration was soon replaced with a cold shock. As he focused on the rifle, he realized that he was there to hunt these majestic animals. Gorman regretted the need for slaughter, especially because these so-called wild creatures appeared tamer than sheep he had seen on a farm. It didn't seem right to kill them. However, he couldn't deny the thrill that came with hunting, and he knew he had to make a decision. Despite his better judgment, Gorman couldn't resist the urge to approach the sheep and see how they would react to a human. He grabbed his .405 rifle and loaded it, causing the sheep to jump at the sound. Gorman rose to his feet and faced the noble ram and his band. To his surprise, they didn't show any sign of fear or aggression. Instead, they seemed curious and even friendly towards him. At first, Gorman thought they might come closer, but he didn't want to take any chances. Raising his rifle, he shot and killed the big leader. The others scattered quickly, and Gorman used up the rest of his shells trying to take down another ram. He soon realized that approaching the sheep this way was not a good idea. He decided to change his strategy and stalk them instead. Stalking the sheep was a challenge that demanded all of Gorman's strength and endurance. He had to be as fast and cunning as a mountain climber and possess the lungs of a marathon runner. The sheep proved to be elusive and difficult to approach, especially after being hunted and shot at. Gorman learned that their reputation as the most observant animals in the wild was well-deserved. To have any chance of success, Gorman had to use his binoculars to locate the sheep and then approach them from the downwind side. He would crawl like a lizard over the rocky terrain, using every ridge and buttress as cover. This technique was not foolproof, and he failed often, but Gorman was determined to get his prey. As the days grew hotter, Gorman adjusted his schedule and began hunting in the early morning hours and late evening before sunset. He knew that he had to be patient and persistent if he wanted to bring down another big ram. For more than one night he lay out on the lava with the great stars close overhead and the immense void all beneath him. He learned to love this pursuit. On those scarred and blasted slopes, the wild spirit within him had free rein, and like a shadow the faithful Yaki tried ever to keep at his heels. One morning the rising sun greeted him as he surmounted the higher cone of the volcano. He saw the vastness of the east aglow with a glazed, rosy whiteness, like the changing hue of an ember. At this height there was a sweeping wind, still cool. The western slopes of lava lay dark, and all that world of sand and gulf and mountain barrier beyond was shrouded in the mystic cloud of distance. Gorman had absorbed much of the loneliness and the sense of ownership and the love of lofty heights that might well belong to the great condor of the peak. Like this wide-winged bird, he had an unparalleled range of vision. The very corners from which the winds came seemed pierced by Gorman's eyes. Yaki spied a flock of sheep far under the curved broken rim of the main crater, then began the stalk. Gorman had taught the Yaki something that speed might win as well as patient cunning. Keeping out of sight, Gorman ran over the spike-crusted lava, leaving the Indian far behind. His feet were magnets, attracting supporting holds, and he passed over them too fast to fall. The wind, the keen air of the heights, the red lava, the boundless surrounding blue, all seemed to have something to do with his wildness. Then, hiding, slipping, creeping, crawling, he closed in upon his quarry until the long rifle grew like stone in his grip, and the whipping spang ripped the silence, and the strange echo boomed deep in the crater and rolled around, as if in hollow mockery at the hopelessness of escape. With an exultant yell, Gorman called out to Yaki not only to signal his location but also to release the joy of action that surged through him. He couldn't help but revel in the strange echoes that bounced off the walls of the crater. The sound was a tumultuous whirl that seemed to burrow deeper and deeper into the world and cavernous walls, as if they were protesting the violation of their silent sanctity. Yet Gorman felt alive, superior to this savage, lifeless iron world. He was a master even of this grandeur and sublimity because he possessed a soul. Waiting for Yaki to catch up, Gorman breathed deeply and scanned the long slopes with practiced eyes. The task at hand was the most arduous of all, packing the best of the heavy sheep down miles of steep, jagged, choya-covered lava. But even this challenge brought Gorman joy. The heat was nothing, nor were the millions of little pits that could twist and trap a foot. The sharp-edged crusts, deep fissures, choked canyons, and tangled, stunted mesquites were mere obstacles to be cheerfully overcome. Only the choya was a hindrance to John Gorman. When his heavy burden caused him to lose his footing and he stumbled into a patch of choya, or when the strange, deceptive, uncanny, and nearly invisible frosty thorns pricked him, he had to summon all his fortitude and endurance. This cactus had a malignant power of torture. Its pain was a stinging, burning, sickening poison that seeped into the bloodstream. If thorns pierced his legs, he felt the pain all over his body. If his hands were covered in barbed joints, he was immobilized and shuddering until Yaki removed them. Yet this one peril, more dreaded than the dizzying heights of a precipice or the sun's blinding glare on a glistening peak, did not daunt Gorman. His teacher was Yaki, and he always had an example before him that made him doubt a white man's equality. In the wilderness, color, race, blood, and breeding held no value. John Gorman learned this lesson as he descended down the lava slope, working tirelessly for hours until he reached the arroyo. He looked like a giant, soaked in sweat, with dark skin and clear eyes. His ragged clothes and boots were covered in white choya thorns. The miller, a thin man, sat in the shade and watched as Gorman arrived, removing his pipe from his lips and nodding at Jim. The summer heat was unbearable, changing the lives of the fugitives. They became nocturnal, seeking refuge from the scorching sun during the day. The nights brought relief with their cool breezes, but they were still long and needed to be filled with work or play, anything but sleep. The sun rose in a white blaze, followed by a withering wind from the gulf. The wind carried a red haze that swept through the arroyo and into the crater, roaring on to lash the peaks. The desert-bound party slept in the recesses of the lava during these hot, windy hours, unable to stay out for long as the sand burned through their boots and the lava would blister their bare hands. At sundown, the Yaki went out to make a campfire, and the others soon followed. They were heat-dazed, half-blind and parched, but the fire and a little action cooled them down and revived them. The miller knew that time was their greatest enemy, and they had to pass the long nights in any way they could, except for sleep. He gave no reason, but his rule was inflexible. Gorman learned the value of hard work and survival in the wilderness. The group had to endure the scorching desert heat and the long, restless nights to survive. They had to be resourceful and stay alert to overcome the challenges that they would face. Despite the difficulties, they were determined to make it through and reach their destination. The ranger may have thought that the scorching heat of the day spent sleeping reduced the wear and tear, if not the actual risk of going insane. Therefore, the little group engaged in various activities at first, if they had something to do or could think of a reason. They recounted stories until they became tedious. They sang songs, and Selena taught Spanish. They played every game they knew, even inventing new ones that were so unimportant that children would hardly have been interested. Yet they played them with sincerity. In summary, they fought the ever-encroaching loneliness and savage isolation of their surroundings with intelligence, passion, and everything that was civilized and humane. However, they had finite minds, and it was unreasonable to expect complete victory against the vast expanse of death and decay that was nature. Gradually, they became less occupied until the silence became difficult to break. Gorman, who believed he was the sharpest of the group and thought the most, observed the effect of the desert on his companions. He thought he saw Miller age as he sat by the campfire. Indeed, the ranger's gray hair turned white. His previously hard and cold demeanor had vanished, and he had become sweet-tempered and absent-minded, lingering in that state as time passed. For what seemed like hours, Miller would stare at his checkerboard without moving, regardless of whether he had a partner. He was always pleased when someone spoke to him, as if he had been called back from a vague region of his mind. Jim Lash, the calmest, most collected, most nonchalant, and best-humored Westerner Gorman had ever met, had gradually lost his cheerful character, which would have been an infinite boon to his companions. He sat brooding, silently brooding. Jim had few ties or memories, and the desert was claiming him. Thorne and Selina were a living testament to the fact that the human spirit, mind, and heart could soar above the barrenness and isolation of the lava prison. They were young, in love, and together, and the oasis they found was almost paradise. Gorman believed he could learn from watching them, as he had never truly understood happiness before. Even though they were in a harsh and lonely spot, they seemed to have forgotten the outside world. Selina grew thinner and tougher, like a wild creature surviving on little food and perhaps even more on love. Her beauty remained undiminished, and she was the life of the camp, bringing joy and playfulness to the rangers. Gorman was able to resist the temptation of a free and unrestrained life thanks to the reminder of their love and passion. Despite the constant presence of the Yaqui, Gorman felt himself wandering alone at times, lost in thought and contemplation. In the deep red twilight, far down the arroyo, Blanco Sol lifted his majestic head and whinnied for his owner. Gorman scolded himself for not paying enough attention to the magnificent horse. Blanco Sol was always happy as long as he had 4 things: his master, a refreshing drink of water, the ability to graze freely, and the chance to run. Time and place didn't matter much to Sol as long as he had those 4 things. Gorman placed his arm over the horse's arched neck and leaned his cheek against the long white mane. Then, even as he stood there, he forgot about the horse. He noticed a dull, red-tinged, horizon-wide cloak creeping up the slope. Was it just twilight, or was it something more sinister? Gorman had a feeling that it was a sign of night, and that he would have to stay up all night to keep watch. This made him shiver with dread. At night-time, Gorman would climb up the lava slope as far as the smooth trail would take him, and there on a promontory he would pace back and forth, gazing at the stars. He would spend hours sitting stone still, staring down at the vast void with its moving, changing shadows. From that promontory he looked up at the deep and dark velvet blue sky, glittering with millions of cold, distant, blinking stars, and he grasped a little of the meaning of infinitude. Gazing down into the shadows, which were black and impenetrable, he felt as though he had a sense of immeasurable space. Then there was the silence, which he found to be overwhelming. Even when the wind roared, there was still a sense of silence. But at night, in this world of ashes and darkness, he waited for this eerie strangeness of nature to come to him with its secrets. He appeared to be both a child and a man, with an air of antiquity that tormented him. The vastness of the space was overwhelming, and the silence was deafening. Gorman felt that the only thing present in the desert was death, but then he heard the beat of a powerful heart. Eventually he realized that the desert was a teacher. He couldn't fully comprehend what he had learned, but he knew that he was a changed man. He wasn't considering the primal instincts of man when he made the decision, but rather that the desert, with all that he had experienced, would completely alter a man's values, break old habits, and form new ones. Gorman believed that more experience in the desert would be too much for the intellect. The desert did not produce civilized men, which made him wonder if the civilized man was inferior to the savage. Yaqui was the answer to this question. Gorman acknowledged this and remembered his current way of thinking. The past and the old way of thinking seemed as distant as the desert was from the civilized world. Gorman realized that before he could speak with authority, he needed to understand a savage like Yaqui. However, something held him back. In the first stage of Gorman's observation of Yaqui, he saw tenacity, stoicism, endurance, and strength, which were all attributes of the desert. But what about the second stage, where Yaqui appeared as a colossal figure with strange honor, loyalty, and love? Gorman began to doubt his convictions and felt ashamed for doing so. In the darkness, Yaqui sat silently and inscrutably with his dark face and eyes visible in the starlight. He was always near Gorman, but never intrusive or overwhelming. Gorman couldn't help but wonder why. He couldn't deny that the Indian had both heart and mind. From the very beginning, Yaqui had been Gorman's protector, shielding him from accidents, hard work, and danger. It was a choice that Yaqui made, and Gorman couldn't sway him. He respected the Indian's sense of duty and obligation. However, there was something more that perplexed Gorman. At night, when he was alone on the slope, he sensed in Yaqui like the strong pulse of the desert, a force that drew him to the Indian. Sometimes he would search for Yaqui to dispel these odd and overwhelming feelings of unreality, and he never came up empty-handed. Thus passed the nights, interminably long, with Gorman fighting for his old way of thinking, fighting against the allure of the vast sky and the immense empty swirl of the shadows, struggling for faith, hope, and prayer, battling against the notion of being lost in the desert and fighting harder than anything else against the penetrating, tranquil, unfeeling self that was coming between him and his memory. He was losing the battle, losing his grip on tangible things, losing his power to endure this heavy, merciless weight of desert space and silence. He recognized it in a kind of hopelessness, and the shadows of the night appeared to be whirling demons. Lost, lost, lost. What are you waiting for? Rain. Lost, lost, lost in the desert. So the shadows seemed to scream in silent ridicule. At that moment he was alone on the promontory. The night was almost over. A pale, eerie moon hung over the black volcanic ridges. The wind blew noiselessly. Was he alone? No, he didn't seem to be alone. Yaqui was there. Suddenly a strange, cold feeling crept over Gorman. It was different. He sensed a presence. Turning, he thought he would see Yaqui, but instead there was a faint shadow, almost white, not too close but not too far away. It seemed to brighten. Then he saw a woman who looked like a girl he had known long ago. Her face was pale and her hair was golden, and her lips were sweet as her eyes turned black. Mona. The memory of her flooded over him. There was a tragic woe in her sweet face. Mona was crying out to him across the sand, cactus and lava, holding out her arms. She was in trouble, and he had forgotten. That night he climbed the lava to the top and didn't slip on a ragged crust or touch a cholla thorn. A voice called to him. Mona's eyes were in the stars, in the velvet blue of the sky, in the blackness of the engulfing shadows. She was with him, a slender shape, a spirit keeping step with him. Memory was strong, sweet, beating, beautiful. Far down in the west, faintly golden with the light of the sinking moon, he saw a cloud that resembled her face. A cloud on the desert horizon. He gazed and gazed. Was that a spirit face like the one by his side? No, he did not dream. In the hot, sultry morning, Yaqui appeared at camp after long hours of absence. He pointed with a long, dark arm toward the west. A bank of clouds was rising above the mountain barrier. "Rain!" he cried, and his sonorous voice rolled down the arroyo. Those who heard him were as shipwrecked mariners at sight of a distant sail. John Gorman, silent and grateful to the depths of his soul, stood with his arm over Blanco's soul and watched the transforming west. Clouds of wondrous size and hue piled over one another, rushing, darkening, spreading, sweeping upward toward the white and glowing sun. When they reached the zenith and swept round to blot out the blazing orb, the earth took on a dark, lowering aspect. The red of sand and lava changed to steely gray. Vast shadows, like ripples on water, sheeted in from the gulf with a low, strange moan. Yet the silence was like death. The desert was bracing itself for an unwelcome and despised visitor, a storm. If all the hot, endless days and mysterious nights had felt unreal to Gorman, then this spectacle was beyond belief. "I felt a raindrop on my face," Selina exclaimed, kissing her husband after whispering a prayer to a saint. The white-haired miller, old, thin, and hunched over, gazed up at the swirling clouds and spoke quietly. "Let's get the horses, pack lightly, and hit the trail. We'll march through the night." Suddenly a roaring wind and a black veil descended upon the west, accompanied by terrifying flashes of lightning and deafening thunder. It was a fury like the end of the world, plunging the desert into chaos and darkness, the desert storm. Chapter 20.